Hello, grade 7, 8, and welcome back to your next lesson as we move forward on our unit on Japan and Japan's worldviews in history. Um, just a quick reminder, what we've looked at so far. We looked at Japan's location in the world. We talked about how it's an archipelago, a combination of smaller islands to make one larger country. We looked at how that fact shaped their worldview and the way that they viewed themselves, the way that they viewed the rest of the world. Then we went on and we looked at the fact of what Japan had within it as a country, and we looked at the fact that it called itself a self-sufficient country. And we learned that self-sufficient meant that they were able to survive on their own. They didn't need help from other countries or outside forces. They had everything they needed within their own country, and they didn't require any assistance to be able to survive as a society. And we talked about how that affected their worldview and how that changed the way they viewed themselves versus other countries and the world as a larger place. And today we're going to look a bit more at the people of Japan. We're going to start to look at how they govern themselves and how that shaped and was shaped by their worldviews. But we're also going to talk about how they viewed themselves as what's called a homogenous society. And the word homogenous is a big, scary word. It might be one that you're like, oh, I think I've heard that before. I hope it is. We talked about it in science, or we talked about words very similar to it. It's okay. It might be one that you say, no, I've never heard of that before at all. And it might be one you say, oh, yeah, I know exactly what that is. And regardless of what your answer is to that, that's okay, because we are going to dig down deeper into its roots and understand exactly what it means and why the Japanese felt that this was a word that in history defined their society and their people. Before we go and look too much further at that, though, I want to go back and look at the geography and landscape of Japan a little bit more, because we talked about the different islands, we talked about the way it was formed, but what we didn't talk about was the mountains. And now, when we talked about mountain formation in science, we learned that when tectonic plates meet and rub against each other, lots of times that's a good location to see mountains form. And then we talked about earlier in this unit how Japan has lots of earthquakes and lots of tsunamis because of the presence of the convergence or meeting of tectonic plates below its country's surface. So obviously that means that it probably has mountains as well. And if you look at this map, you can see all this brown is actually representing where there's larger than average landscape or lots of times mountains. You can see the Japanese Alps here even. And you see that it kind of stretches actually all the way down the country and kind of all over the country. And before we talk about that a bit more, I want to draw your attention to right here, Mount Fuji, which is an incredibly cool location. It's actually a volcano. And here's a closer picture. It's absolutely beautiful. It's one of the places that I want to go. Top of my list. I'd love to go there and see it. As the entire country of Japan is top of my list. But a few facts about it, because I think it's just really cool. It's 12,400 feet in elevation high. It's a dormant volcano. And I hope you remember from science this year that a dormant volcano means that it hasn't erupted in a very long time, but it is still possible that it could erupt. We call volcanoes that would never erupt again extinct. But this isn't extinct, it's dormant. That just means it's kind of sleeping, and it could erupt again. Its last eruption was in 1707, so it hasn't done it for a very, very long time, but they haven't considered it extinct quite yet. But besides that, the mountains, like we talked about, run all the way down the center. And you would expect, especially back in this age when it was hard to travel, lots of reliance on horses and beasts of burden, there wasn't a lot of vehicles and things like that. It wasn't easy to fly over mountains, so you'd expect that ranges like this would separate a people, and maybe you'd get people on one side of the mountains that were much different than people on the other side of the mountains. But the Japanese certainly did not see this, because they viewed themselves as what we were calling a homogeneous society. They viewed themselves as being one group, because when we break down into the word homogeneous, and we break it down into its root words. When we were in science, we talked about homozygous, meaning that it had both of the same genes or both of the same alleles. We talked about genetics, and that was mostly in the grade 9 unit. But we talked about the root word homo, meaning same, and hetero being the opposite, meaning different, right? And then we can look even closer at the root word of genus or gene, and in the Greek, root word of that meant race or kind. So same kind. Oops. So you can see that the Japanese calling themselves a homogeneous or a homogeneous society meant that they really believed that all the people of Japan weren't like different groups. They were all Japanese. They were all one larger group or one larger society that all shared the same customs and the same beliefs and same traditions. And in lots of cases, that can be a really cool and powerful thing to feel like you're part of one huge group. But as you can imagine, sometimes that can also lead to dangerous situations and maybe situations that aren't as good. We like to talk about in Canada here a lot how we're very diverse and we like to have, we're all Canadian, but we like to have, we're different Canadians, right? And we celebrate our differences and our different religions and beliefs and traditions. But it wasn't always that way here either. We've made mistakes as well, and you're going to see that this striving and fight to be homogenous also had negative impacts in Japan, just like it did here in Canada with our First Nations when we talked about Orange Shirt Day and the assimilation, residential schools, and everything that we talked about earlier. Because the Japanese had a group very similar to our First Nations called the Ainu. And they were a group that lived in the northern part of Japan. They lived there for like several thousand years, and they had their own separate society and territory. But eventually, the other Japanese groups, in their strive to be homogenous and strive to be one big Japan, they began to take over their lands. And the Ainu fought several wars of resistance against their control, but they were defeated each time. And eventually, all their territory officially became part of Japan, and the island where most of them lived was renamed Hokkaido. We talked about that being that northern island of the archipelago. And when this happened, the Japanese kind of began a program of assimilation. And that's a word we should be familiar with. We talked about it like I keep going back to when we talked about our own First Nations, because assimilation means to basically make something the same or make something similar to you. And that's what the Japanese tried to do with the Ainu, just like we tried to do with our First Nations. And even though these are sad moments in history, it's important that we talk about them and recognize that they happened so that we make sure that we don't make these same mistakes again. We can learn from our mistakes in the past. Because the program that they started to assimilate these people was they forbid them to speak their language, they forbid them to practice their traditions, and they were restricted to living only in small areas that the government set out for them. They were given land to farm, but unfortunately they were a fishing and hunting community, so farmland wasn't something they were very familiar with and something they were very good at, so it didn't fit into their traditions and their cultures. So just a quick little story on that, just so you can see that although it's nice to be a homogenous society and be very similar, we do need to celebrate our differences and not force people to assimilate or be the same as we are. So now let's look a little closer at the historical, and I mean very historical. We're talking the 1600s to the mid 1800s rule of Japan and how Japan was governed and who was like the big shots. And we'll call this Japan under the shogun. And so this area we're going to look at is 100 years before the Edo period. And the Edo period is a period we're going to focus on a lot in the coming weeks. And Edo was the traditional or the early name for Tokyo, which is now the capital of Japan. But the time we're going to look at was, like I said, much before the Edo period. And in this time, Japan was locked in a constant warfare, constant battle between different groups. And and battle between powerful landowners or nobles. And when we look back at our units on Aztec and the Spanish, we know that lots of different societies referred to their people who owned land and owned the people on that land as nobles. And that was the same in Japan. But Japan did have a fancy name for the nobles, the daimyo. And like I said, the daimyo were just the landowners who controlled huge areas, and they were fighting with each other. Why were they fighting with each other? Well, the typical reasons everybody fights or has wars. They fought over power, and they fought over territory, so land, and they fought over the resources that was on that land, and how they could use it to pretty much get more power and more territory by fighting more battles. Um, how did this ever end? What did it take to finally end this? Well, the answer is one very strong and very clever leader. And we go back to this gentleman that we had the picture of originally. And his name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he became one of the most powerful men in all of Japan after he was able to defeat almost all his rival daimyo and generals in a great battle and great battles. Um, and after he was able to, we won't get too much into how he won these big battles, but he was very clever, like we said, very powerful, and he won. And in 1603, the emperor made him the shogun. And although the emperor technically was the ruler of all of Japan, the shogun really held all the power. He was the big shot in Japan and made all the big calls. Now, uh, Ieyasu had won his power through military, but obviously, since he won it through conflict, he probably was going to have to defend it as well. And there was constantly going to be people coming and trying to take this power, the great title as a shogun, back from him. So, in the next couple of days, and what you're going to do on your own today, a little bit, you're going to do some research, and you're going to discover this was, like I said, a clever man, and he put in place rules and laws and sorry if you can hear that train in the background there. He put rules into place and laws and loopholes that made sure that the other nobles were never able to rise back up to where they needed to be to contest him or to oppose his power and overthrow him. He wasn't just clever in battle, but he was clever all around, and he made sure that he was going to hold his power for a very long time. So what I'm going to get you guys to do today is I'm going to have you complete the reading, which I posted on Classroom, called Power and Control. I want you to look quickly and go through some of the problems that the shogun faced and the solutions he came up with to try and keep his power. When you're done that, it's in the same document, but there's an assignment below called Problems and Solutions of the Shogun. And I'd like you to, on one side, list the possible problems that you've read or that you can think of that he would have faced at this time. And then I want you to face the solutions, whether they were good, bad, fair, or maybe not so nice, but the solutions that he came up with to solve those problems and make sure that they weren't problems for him anymore. And then on Friday, we will take a closer look at those together and continue through with this unit. Have a great day, everybody, and as always, if you have questions, email me or drop into my office hours.